In this episode, have you been wondering about getting an airbrush? All right, so over the last, honestly, couple of years, I've had a lot of people in comments in the videos, in messages on Facebook, all kinds of different, vectors. People have been coming at me and asking me questions about airbrushes. I talk about airbrushing on and off in the videos that I do about painting. I talk about how I like to airbrush a little bit, and I like to use it for a lot of different things. I mentioned it pretty heavily in the understanding underpainting video, chow up there, which you should probably watch if you want to understand underpainting. But a lot of people ask me, well, are you going to do a video about, airbrushing? I need to know how to airbrush. What should I do? That kind of stuff. So this is the first in a small, undefined series of videos about airbrushing. And so I'm going to touch on the large kind of overview of why you want to airbrush and kind of what kind of airbrush you might want to look for. Now, I live in Wisconsin, which is in the northern part of America. What that means is that any given year, between 5 and 7 months of that year, Wisconsin is a frozen hellscape. Some may refer to it as a glorious winter wonderland. Your mileage may vary. But the fact is that it is not rattle can weather. So those of you out there who like to prime your miniatures and you live in a place that's generally kind of dry and usually temperate or warm, you are lucky because you can go out and, prime miniatures anytime you want with a rattle can. I can't do that here. If it's not cold and inhospitable to rattle cans and people, then it is hot and humid and also inhospitable to rattle cans and people to some degree. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to get an airbrush. I wanted to be able to prime miniatures in the house. One of the reasons you don't want to prime with a rattle can in the house is because the propellant is toxic at the very least and stinky at bad. Someone will get ticked off if you do that in the house. But with an airbrush, it generally is not the case because it's using compressed air, which smells like air. That was the first step. That was really what drew me to airbrushing. Was I wanted to be able to prime on Christmas Day when there was 2 feet of snow outside and then be able to work on my models. Otherwise, I was basically working and getting all my models done the last warm day of fall so that I had stuff to paint over the winter because I couldn't prime any new models over the winter. What are other reasons that you might want to get an airbrush besides priming? Well, another thing is base coating. Okay, so once you've primed the models with your airbrush, you may want to base coat them, which is to say make them a color. At the time when I got into airbrushing, I was also getting into Warhammer 40,000. Warhammer 40,000 has a lot of vehicles in it. No one wants to paint a Land Raider with a brush. Land Raider's this big, the brush is that big, then nobody wants to do that. So my thought process was, well, I'll use the airbrush, it'll make painting those things a lot quicker, which it did. And but it also allowed me to be able to do shading and highlighting, which is a third reason that you might want to use an airbrush. So here's a picture of, he is a figure from House Hadros from the Wrath of Kings, and you can see so I originally primed him like a light gray, then I base coated him in that kind of green, and then I used almost kind of like a yellowy from above. So if the model is here, I was spraying it mostly from above. Look at this. So I was spraying the model kind of from above to get the lighter parts to hit the top of his head and the top of his shoulders and the top of his weird jellyfish tummy and all that stuff. And it allows you to make things highlightable, highlighted very quickly. You can sit there and kind of just make it look like you're a better painter than you are. Here, my Warriors of Chaos, you'll see that cape on the background there, on the back of the warrior. That is not me wet blending from light green to almost black. That is me priming the guy black, then taking a light gray primer afterwards, spraying him from above and making that gradient, which is not too hard to do once you practice it a little bit. And then I just threw a green wash over it and it looks kind of pro, sort of, I like it. I think it turned out well. And it's quick and easy to do with an airbrush. So priming, base coating, and highlighting. Those are, for me at least, the first 3 big steps of things that you're going to get to improve and be able to do better with an airbrush. so what kind of airbrush, should you get or whatever? I get that question asked more intelligently, of course, quite frequently. And so, okay, this airbrush you'll see has a cup on the top. So this is what they call a gravity feed airbrush, which means the paint goes in here in this cup, and then the gravity of the earth pulls it down into the line where the air blows through and shoots it out onto whatever you're painting, okay? That is better for miniatures painters than the other kind of airbrush, which is called siphon feed. It has no cup on top and instead has a little glass bottle that goes on the bottom. Now, the reason that we don't like to use siphon feed as miniatures painters is because we have a tendency to work in relatively low pressure air, low PSI, pounds per square inch. I generally set my compressor between 15 and 20 PSI. That's a little bit more technical than you need to know, except that when the pressure is low like that, the way that the paint gets sucked out of siphon feed is that enough pressure goes through that it causes a siphon effect, hence the name, siphon feed, and then it sucks up the paint and blows it out. You have to have your paint pressure, your airbrush pressure set a lot higher from your compressor to make that stuff work properly. When it's just dropping down in front of the air and being blown out, you can set it a lot lower. Trying to paint a delicate model that's about this close, you need lower pressure. When you are in the mall airbrushing t-shirts, you want higher pressure. And then in that situation, you can be spraying red, and then you can pop that bottle off, put a bottle of cleaner in it, spray it out, pop that bottle of cleaner off, pop on a bottle of purple, and then go back to airbrushing. That's the whole point. Guys who work in the mall and spray paint airbrushes and other kinds of things like that, who need to switch colors a lot, they want the siphon feed. You and I, as miniatures painters, we want that top cup. We want the gravity feed because you want to have a lower PSI. Another thing that you want is a two-stage airbrush. So you press down on this button, and that controls how much air you get. But you also pull back, which you probably can't see here. You can press down and pull back. Pulling back increases the amount of paint. Pressing down increases the amount of air. So you can just press down and not pull back to just blow air if you're trying to dry something, a little bit in between coats. Or, if you just want to just do the littlest bit of air, you can press down and then pull back just a little bit. Or you can just hammer back if you're trying to like prime something or coat something a lot. You've got those choices. There are airbrushes out there that only have a single action lever, and you don't want those. You want gravity feed, and you want a dual action or two-stage, whatever they might call it, lever. Those are the two things that I find to be most important when you're trying to paint for miniatures. Now, what brand should you get? Honestly, it doesn't matter. This is an Iwata Eclipse. This is an HPCS. It's made in Japan. I know that Badger is another big name, and a lot of people like Badger. I think those are mostly made in America. Pache, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it, but they're also a well-known brand. Amongst miniatures guys, I mainly know people who either are Iwata or Badger or use both, whichever. I bought this because I could get it at Hobby Lobby for 40% off, but I've been very happy with it. I've been using it for 4 years now, and it works great. I love using it for priming, base coating, highlighting. I even can sometimes do a little bit of detail work, but I don't think that the needle in this one is fine enough to do really fine needle work. Well, you're going to need to blow air through it. That's why they call it an airbrush. So you need a compressor. When I first started, I bought an inexpensive compressor from my hardware store. It's a big red tank and loud, and it was maybe about $60. It's got like a 2-gallon tank, and you turn it on, and it is loud as the dickens until it fills up the tank, and then it shuts off, and it's quiet. And then you start spraying, and you're spraying, and you're spraying, and it's coming out of the tank, and you're having a good time, and you're spraying, and maybe you're listening to music, and you're doing stuff, and things are going pretty well, and then you've used up most of the air in the tank, and then the compressor kicks in again. And if you're me, it scares the crap out of you about every other time. And so the upside to using a compressor like that is it's cheap, $60 generally. You can go to pretty much any hardware store. You might have to get some special fittings to attach it to the hose so that you can kind of get everything to work. But honestly, they work pretty well. And I used it for quite a number of years until it started to crap out a little bit. And then I thought, at this point, I'm going to upgrade to a real airbrush compressor. Now, a real airbrush compressor, meaning a compressor that is designed for airbrushing, usually made by companies like Badger or Iowata or Sparmax or lots of different companies, those compressors are almost always very quiet in comparison. Many of them do not have a tank. So, like mine currently doesn't have a tank. It pretty much just runs. As soon as I start spraying, it just kicks in. And then as soon as I stop, it stops, which is crazy. And I'm not quite sure how it works. I'm sure there's science involved, but it's really kind of nice. So I can just sit there and be like, yeah, okay, great. And then I start spraying, and then you can hear it kick in. But it's very quiet in comparison. They have a tendency, from what I understand, due to the mechanism, they have a tendency sometimes to get oil condensation that goes through the hose from an airbrush type compressor. So you want to have something called a moisture trap, which usually comes with airbrushes, or it'll come with a compressor, depends. And it's just basically like a thing that you attach that once in a while it's like a spit valve on a trumpet. If you ever played trumpet in band or something like that, you just kind of blow it out and stuff comes out. And then it doesn't get into your paint and onto your model, which you don't want. With a bigger like hardware store type compressor, you don't usually have that trouble because of the tank. A lot of the air compression stuff and the stuff that's coming off the compressor stays in the tank, so it's not that big of a deal. But airbrush compressors are more expensive than hardware compressors, obviously. But they're quieter, they're designed more for airbrush, they have a steady pressure, they're really nice that way. We have a place called Hobby Lobby here in America. I bought my Iowata Eclipse brush for 40% off of whatever it was at the time, which was probably close to $200. So 40% off of that. My compressor was a little right near $300, and it was like the most expensive one they sold there. But again, I got it 40% off because Hobby Lobby's got this great coupon that you can get on their app and stuff, and then you get 40% off of any single one thing that's not already on sale. So if you're in America, you might look into that. If you're in other countries that have places like that, you might look into it. Otherwise, maybe you want to buy online, buy direct from the manufacturer. There's a lot of different options. One thing I wouldn't do, I wouldn't buy a $20 airbrush because you're not going to be happy with it. Even if you're just like, I'm going to get my toe wet and just try. I found this airbrush on eBay for $20, and the whole kit and everything, and the hose and all that stuff. It's not a great idea because it's gonna go bad quickly. There's nothing more frustrating than a relatively simple machine that will not do its job and blow paint out, and you're like, I can't figure out why. Keeping them clean is super important. I'll get into that in another episode, but for now, spend a little bit more on the brush. Get something, maybe spend $100. Something along those lines, you're going to be a lot happier in the long run. If you want to go, full hog on it, great, but, you want to at least not buy like a $20 thing you found on eBay. It's just going to work better for you in the long run. Lastly, I'm just going to touch on paints. I'll probably touch on those more in a future episode. The paints, you can't just take a normal like Vallejo paint or Games Workshop paint and just dump it in there and go to town. It's going to be too thick. You need to thin your paints to make them spray through the airbrush better, okay? So some people will thin them with water. Some people use Windex. Some people use alcohol. A lot of different people have a lot of different ideas. Like I said, in a future video, I'll tell you how I do it. But you can also just buy airbrush paints that are already pre-thinned, sort of, and are designed to go through airbrush. I use Vallejo Model Air and Vallejo Game Air paints, which are designed to go through airbrush. I use them a ton, and I like them quite a bit. There are other brands out there, Scale 75. Even Games Workshop has gotten into airbrush paints recently. There's a lot of different manufacturers out there. If you buy those paints, you can generally use them straight out of the pot that way. Just drop a couple of drops in there and start working. But otherwise, you can use your normal paints. You just need to thin them. So understand that, and don't try to just take a big glob of Abaddon black, stick it in there and go to town, because that's not going to work. So anyway, I hope that this helped you at least understand a little bit, get a beginning idea about airbrushing. There's a great big wide world of web out there for you to do more research and kind of learn things. But, talk to people who already know that airbrush. Go online, look at articles, things like that. Just type in beginning to airbrush for miniatures or whatever. But like I said, I'll have more episodes soon kind of touching on some more things. But I wanted to tell you guys that airbrushing, kind of like the wet palette. I've told you guys about the wet palette and how it made my painting that much better. This is another one of those tools. If you're getting interested in miniature painting and you're starting to do it more, a relatively inexpensive, not super cheap, but a relatively inexpensive airbrush and even a hardware store type compressor can really start to make it so that you can put out much better looking work in less time because, the brush stroke, you just spraying it out. It's an amazing technology. I mean, it's not really a technology. It's like cavemen were blowing paint through reeds that they found probably back like in the 1950s or whenever there were cavemen. But you should really think about getting an airbrush. And if you've got some questions, you know how I like to answer questions in the comments. So down below, hit me up and I can try to tell you some things and give you some more knowledge.